Good evening and welcome. Welcome to everyone this evening. I hope you all had a lovely St. Patrick's Day yesterday. Those of you that were celebrating such a thing, as we did. As you probably saw if you looked on Facebook, you'll see some pictures of myself and Olivia dressed up in a suitably Hibernian fashion. Hello, Sue. Good evening, Julie. So we had fun. We went to the procession, a grand procession through London that ended up in Trafalgar Square, where, of course, thousands of people had gathered. So our idea was that we would get to Trafalgar Square and see the kind of live events. Hello, Cindy. Hello, Pat. But sadly, that wasn't to be. There were just too many people there, which is understandable. I think 50,000 people were there at the St. Patrick's Day event. Good evening, Dawn. So, yeah. But we still had fun in the parade. Watching all the floats go by. Very multicultural celebration of St. Patrick's Day. Plenty of Irish music, though, and lots of leprechauns, lots of green, that kind of thing. So tonight I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour around the Magnificent Seven. And you can see them all here on this interactive map. You can find this map online and it's really cool. And it gives you a kind of brief guide to the Magnificent Seven. And that's what I'm going to do. Give you a guide to these incredible cemeteries that the kind of epitome of cemetery design in the Victorian period. And it was really only in the Victorian period that these cemeteries were popular and fashionable. And very soon after that, they went out of fashion. For various reasons that I'll explain a bit later. Hello, Melanie. Good evening to you. Good evening, Lynn. I hope you're all well. Hope you enjoyed St. Patrick's Day yesterday. We did, as you can probably see. If you look on Facebook, you'll find an interesting picture of myself and Olivia dressed up to the nines in our St. Patrick's Day gear. Me complete with green beard, which everyone seemed to think was rather cool. So I was happy with that. So we've still got 9 minutes to go. To go. I'm hearing myself in stereo there. That's good, isn't it? Hello, Barry. Hi, Dawn. Emma, you like a good cemetery. So do I. You're a coimetrophile like me. Oh yes, Dawn, I've done this tour before. I enjoy it. It's one of my favourites. It's a bit like my Monopoly tour. It's a kind of a feat of talking a lot in order to get you around all 7 cemeteries. I reminded you of an 80s rap artist. MC Richmond coming at ya from London, innit? Oh, we've got 13 people. Oh, that's not good. My triskaidekaphobia is affecting me. Hello, Chicago. Popping in and out. That's okay. I won't be offended. There's a lot of cemeteries to get through. You can't watch them all. Hello, Cheryl. Good evening to you. I did, Dawn. Way back in the days of Highgate was when we first went around the Magnificent Seven. Does your cat count as an additional person? He's on my lap. I'm sure he does count as an additional person, Deborah. We wouldn't want to leave him out. Cats and cemeteries have a strong connection. What they used to do, in fact, was that with new cemeteries and graveyards, the first person that they buried there wasn't a person. So they had this old tradition that the first thing to be buried in a graveyard would be a cat or a dog. And the idea was that dogs and cats didn't have souls and humans did. And it was meant to be bad luck to be the first person to be buried in a cemetery. So there we go. All of that means that, of course, your cat, Deborah, is very welcome indeed. Hello, Esther. So yes, this tour I first did in the halcyon days of Highgate, and it was one that I researched during the not so halcyon days of COVID. So while everyone else was busy doing other stuff, I was walking around many of these cemeteries, getting information, taking videos, some of which you'll see tonight. And at the time, because of social distancing, they had a scheme where you could get into the east part of Highgate, the west part of Highgate free, whereas normally you have to go around with a guide. Instead, you'd be able to look around at your leisure, which was pretty cool. So we've still got 5 minutes to go. Good evening again, everyone that's joining us tonight. What you're looking at is an interactive map that you can find online. So Dawn, I like to quote Morrissey when I do my graveyard tours and cemetery tours. And in one of Morrissey's songs called Cemetery Gates, he said, "A dreaded sunny day, so let's go where we're happy and I'll meet you at the cemetery gates." So yeah, that's kind of my attitude. They are really nice, peaceful places. No, exactly, Sarah. They're not. They weren't halcyon days at all, but it did give me an opportunity to wander around these 7 cemeteries. Hello, Fliss. Good evening to you. We're just talking about the work of Morrissey and the Smiths, and a very famous song called Cemetery Gates, where Morrissey extols the virtues of wandering round cemeteries. And I agree with him. I think they're great places as well. So, of course, hello, good evening. You will notice that I'm... Hello, Welpuri. Good evening to you. You'll notice that I am in the comfort and security of my own home, and that's because, well, several reasons. One of them is that I can't really take you round all these 7 cemeteries in anything resembling an hour and a half in real life, and certainly not at night. That would be problematic, because only 2 of these cemeteries you can get into at night. The others are all locked up. Hello, Martin. And the other one was that I developed this as an at-home tour. Not long now, you've been told, Fliss, you've been told you're only allowed 1 cemetery. Well, we know which one that's going to be, don't we? It's got to be Highgate. That's everyone's favourite, and you'll see why. So we've still got a couple of minutes to go. Highgate is definitely the best known. Brompton, you think? Okay, I like Brompton. Brompton's nice, but it's kind of, it's the opposite of Highgate. Highgate is wild and unkempt and quite mysterious. whereas Brompton, because it's a royal cemetery, is really well laid out. You used to eat your lunch in Bunhill Cemetery. Such a peaceful place. Oh yes, so peaceful. Its history is not so peaceful. Body snatchers and plague victims. And it's where the poor of the city were buried, sometimes 5 deep. Hello, Janet. Exactly, Dawn, and that's what the Victorians liked as well. They liked the fact that these cemeteries were grown over, and I'll explain the reasons behind that as well. So there we are. We are pretty much ready to start. So good evening and welcome. You'll steer the family the way you want them to go. Oh yes, you've got to go to the Church of St. Olave's. It's a great church. So here you can see an interactive map that shows what are known as the Magnificent Seven. And it's no real reference to the Western of the same name or the Kurosawa film on which it was based. The Magnificent Seven are 7 cemeteries around London that were all built around the same time, between the 1820s and the 1840s. And this was the height of cemetery design. So these are the prime examples of cemetery design in London. And this map that you can see is an interactive map that you can find online. And it's quite fun because you can click on each cemetery and get a little breakdown of some of the most famous things that have happened there. Or you can join this tour and I can show you around all 7 cemeteries in one evening. I can't do that in real life, of course, that would take far too long. But what I can do is, well, in the words of Blue Peter, here's one that I prepared earlier. All the cemeteries we're going to visit, by the way, also have their own trusts, their own groups that look after them. Many of them have fallen into disrepair, and the only reason they're still standing is because of groups like this. They raise money through all sorts of talks and events. So all of them are looked after by different organisations. And they often do their own tours as well, their own guided tours. And that's another reason why I can't do a guided tour of many of these cemeteries in person, because I'd be kind of stepping on people's toes. Hello, Anna-Katrin. Good evening to you. But all of these cemeteries came about because of a population problem in London in the beginning of the 19th century. And the problem was that too many people were dying, not just in London, but in many major cities around the country. There were too many people being buried and not enough space to bury them. And especially in London, where thousands of people were flooding in after the Industrial Revolution, they were all coming to find London's streets supposedly paved with gold. But what they found instead was poverty, misery, hard work at factories and dangerous work, and disease that spread through the city like wildfire. And because of that, there were lots of people dying in the capital, and there wasn't enough room to bury them all. Charles Dickens tells a famous story in his diaries of the time. He says that he was out with a friend, and his friend had just had a relative who died. His friend took the coffin to a nearby graveyard and asked the gravediggers if they could bury his friend. But the gravediggers said, "No, there's no room, mate. It's all full in here. You'll have to go somewhere else." And then they spotted Mr. Dickens, and they changed their mind because they recognised this eminent author. So they said, "Oh, all right then, we'll find some room for you. Hold on." And they proceeded to dig up a grave that had been freshly dug a couple of weeks ago, take out the coffin and stamp it to bits, including the occupant, squelched with their boots. And once they'd reduced it to nothing, then they had room to bury the new coffin. So this was a real story from the time, and it shows the problems of overcrowding in London cemeteries. We still have some of those problems today. There were other problems as well, because these graveyards and churchyards were in the city limits. It led to huge overcrowding, and all the graveyards and churchyards in the middle of London began to suffer. This is a picture, for example, of Enon Chapel, and it's in Soho, right in the heart of London. Underneath the chapel, you might be able to make out there are coffins down there, and that's because this was used as the vaults. So coffins would be stored down here rather than in the graveyard. But the vicar of Enon Chapel was an unscrupulous chap, and he decided that in order to create more room down in the vaults for the new coffins that were being put down there, it might be better just to get rid of the coffins themselves and leave the bodies piled in heaps on top of each other. Now this led to certain problems because the bodies, especially in the summer, began to decompose at a rapid rate, and it caused a terrible smell. Clouds of black flies began to come up through the floorboards, known as coffin flies. And this was a problem, especially when they held nursery schools there at the weekends. They also held dances, as you can see here. And eventually the smell began to waft up through the floorboards. The authorities intervened and realised that the vicar had been cutting corners, shall we say, in order to make more profit, because he would be paid for every coffin that was put down there. And because of this, the newspapers began to talk about the problems of London burial. The state of the churchyards of the metropolis is at once disgusting and dangerous, and calls loudly for legislative interference. To know that the population of London is exposed to the pestilent miasma of our burial grounds, situated as they are in the very midst of the densely crowded neighbourhoods, is calculated to excite the most painful apprehensions for the public safety. A grave was opened in Aldgate churchyard on Friday, and immediately the pestilential exhalations destroyed the gravedigger, and also another man who went, after a considerable time, to his aid. So all of these stories were true. The stories of overcrowded churchyards, of the smell, the miasma as it was called at the time, that was infecting the population. Something needed to be done, and eventually, after quite a few years, the government decided to act. You know that the government doesn't usually act in anything like enough time. They always have to be persuaded. But in the end, Parliament got involved. Oh, there's my parliamentary reference, by the way. Not sure how I'm going to fit scaffolding in this one, but I shall do my best. Parliament created an Act. And this was an Act, the General Act for the Interment of the Dead in the neighbourhood of the metropolis, and it did what it said on the tin. The idea of this Act was to create purpose-built cemeteries, and also to stop burials from happening in churchyards inside the City of London. And that's true to this very day. So this Act that was introduced in 1820 made it possible to design purpose-built cemeteries that were meant to be extramural outside the city walls. Like the Romans had done hundreds of years ago, they had the same idea. They put their cemeteries safely outside the city walls. And so the Corporation of London decided to follow in that Act. And it allowed companies to spring up, and it became, as you can probably imagine, a money-making business. One of the first of these countries one of the first of these organisations was the London Cemetery Company, as you can see here. And they were among the first to create these purpose-built cemeteries. As you can see here, St James at Highgate, now simply known as Highgate Cemetery. All Saints at Nunhead, again, now simply known as Nunhead Cemetery. These were some of the first purpose-built cemeteries to be built in the country. But they were all based on a French design. Because, as usually happens, the French beat us to it. They came up with the idea first. And this was something called Père Lachaise Cemetery, a huge purpose-built cemetery in the middle of Paris. And it's famously where Oscar Wilde is buried, among many other influential people of the time. So this was the inspiration for the design of these new cemeteries, based on Père Lachaise in Paris. Now, when I was doing my research for this tour and many other tours, I do several tours around cemeteries and graveyards, I decided to try and find out what that made me, apart from a bit weird. Was there a name for a person like me? So first I came up with the idea of necrophile, but that wasn't quite right. That didn't quite fit the bill. And then I came up with the idea of someone who worships the dead, called a necrotophile. But the real word is a koimetrophile. And this comes from koimeterion. And this is a Greek word. And the Greek word koimeterion literally means sleeping place, the last rest of the righteous. So koimeterion eventually evolved into the word cemetery that we have now. And from that you get the word koimetrophile. So that's what I am, and that's what you are too. I'm sure, because you're watching this. You're also koimetrophiles. Now, to take you around these 7 cemeteries, we obviously needed some transport. I did try ringing for an Uber, but they were all fully booked. So instead, we've hired the services of a very famous family. The Munsters are going to show us around London, or more specifically, around the 7 cemeteries. So there he is, Herman Munster is at the wheel, getting ready to go. And we're going to hitch a ride with them around these 7 cemeteries. And we're starting off in North London, a place called Stoke Newington, which is now a very fashionable and gentrified area. And we're heading through the traffic. There's always traffic in London. And roadworks. There we go. That's near enough to scaffolding. That will do, I think. You're a big whatever you said. It's called a koimetrophile, Fliss. That's what you are. So we're heading through the cemetery, the traffic and the scaffolding. Well, it's roadworks, really, but it'll do. And heading towards our first cemetery. And here's the grand entrance. And the entrance is Egyptian in style. And this was quite a new thing. Egyptology had just taken off big time in Britain. And there was an explosion in all things Egyptian. And that included cemetery design. Although it wasn't terribly popular at the time, many people didn't like it. But here you can see these Egyptian-designed front gates and entrance. And as we go through these churchyards and cemeteries, you'll find many more Egyptian references. Egyptian-styled tombstones and symbology that were very popular at the time. This is a kind of pastiche, a satire on what this cemetery entrance looked like when it was first opened. And it's kind of overemphasising the point, making it out to be some sort of Egyptian pyramid style structure, but actually it just had Egyptian thematic elements, which was just as fun. And we'll see some of them as we go round. On top of many tombstones, you've got all sorts of Egyptian symbology. You've got Egyptian plinths, all sorts of things. So this is the first part of our tour. The first cemetery we're going to is Abney Park, built in 1840. It's not the oldest of the Magnificent Seven, but it is one of the most interesting. So this is Abney Park, an aerial view, and it was opened in 1840. It's 121,000 square metres, and the number of burials since it opened is around 200,000. That number, by the way, is not going to increase because Abney Park is not now a working cemetery. Good evening, Ilka. That was perfect timing. You're just in time to join us on a trip into Abney Park. And that's the first of the Magnificent Seven that we're looking at tonight. Now, as well as the cemetery design and some of the famous people that were buried there, I'm also going to be talking about traditions that were important in Victorian burials. And one of the most important was having what was called a good death. In Victorian terms, having a good death meant that there were several elements to your funeral, one of the most important of which was getting into the cemetery in the right way. And that, of course, meant a black carriage pulled by black-plumed horses, black being the colour of the day. And you can still see these hearses plying their trade all around the country. Oh, good evening, Olivia. Welcome to you. I feel that you're strangely close to me tonight. Possibly in the next room. Who knows? So this was the important thing, that you would get into the cemetery the right way, in a black-plumed carriage pulled by black-plumed horses. But if you wanted something a little different, if you wanted something that set you apart from the other corpses that were being trundled into the cemetery, then you could employ your own mourners. And these usually came in pairs, as you can see here, although I think this is the same mourner wearing two different costumes. And they were called mutes. And the idea was, as the name suggests, that their job was to walk in front of the funeral cortege and say very little. Unless, of course, they were approached by someone who might ask who was being buried. In which case they would say, he was an amazing person. He did great deeds for charity. That kind of thing. They would basically big up the person that's being buried. So they were called mutes, and they would walk in front of the funeral cortege. In Dickens' Oliver Twist, young Oliver himself is employed briefly as one of these mutes, working for a funeral company, Sowerby and Sons, and he walks in front of the funeral cortege as a child mute, looking rather angelic by all accounts. But the mutes had another job as well, and the job that they also had relates to what they're carrying. These are ceremonial brooms, and the idea was at the end of the funeral they would walk back along the route and clean up, because obviously, the carriage was pulled by horses, so they would be there to clean up the poo on the way back using their ceremonial brooms. So I said earlier that I did videos when I went to many of these cemeteries. And this is footage of the entrance to Abney Park. And as you might be able to see, there's a lot of foliage around, a lot of greenery. And that's because Abney Park has been, for much of its lifetime, left to its own devices, and nature has taken over. But among all this nature, you can also find some very famous graves. In fact, as soon as you walk into Abney Park through the main entrance, you'll find two of them. on either side of each other. And therefore the founder of the Salvation Army, William Booth, and his wife Catherine. So this is William Booth and Catherine, together the founders of the Salvation Army that helps and still helps so many people around the country. And William Booth, of course, as well as being the founder of the Salvation Army, was also the long-time winner of the Best Beard competition, the Victorian Beard competition as it was known. He won the title several times, and we'll see that as we look at other pictures. His wife Catherine is on the right, and Catherine Booth was just as much a force of nature as William was. This is what she said. This is one of her many famous quotes. "If we are to better the future, we must disturb the present," which I think is a really cool quote. So Catherine and William are buried here opposite each other at the entrance to Abney Park. But here you can see William Booth in his later days, and again sporting a magnificent beard, one that you could comfortably lose a badger in. So he was the winner for many years of this greatest beard competition. It was very important. Here you can see another one, showing a new and different beard. Oh, and there's another one that makes him look a bit like George Bernard Shaw. "You were born in one of their hospitals in Sydney, in a Salvation Army hospital. That's cool. What a claim to fame, Fliss. That's brilliant." But as you walk further into the cemetery, you realise that the well-tended graves at the entrance are not the norm in this place. And that's because it's been given over to nature. And that's because it's not a working cemetery anymore. In fact, it's a nature trail. And in 2010, it was declared a national nature trail. And you can see that. When you walk down the side paths, you can find wood chip that you would find on all sorts of public parks and woodland areas. And everything is covered in ivy. Everything is partially hidden. And that's what makes it so exciting. And the Victorians thought that too. They liked the idea of these overgrown cemeteries. For them, it gave it a romantic feel. Now, as we go around the cemetery, not just in Abney Park, but also in most of the cemeteries in London, you can find all sorts of funeral ware, tombstones and monoliths and things like that reflect the culture and the history of Victorian Britain. For instance, you'll find many Celtic crosses, like this huge example on the left that you can find in Abney Park. And they reflect the Victorians' great love of all things Gothic architecture and Gothic novels. And on the right-hand side, you can see a collection of angels, most of them missing their limbs. So this was the age of neo-Gothic, Gothic architecture, like the Houses of Parliament. There we are, you see, I've mentioned it again. Gothic fiction, like Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, is said to be one of the first great Gothic novels of its time. And you have things like these angels. But as you take a closer look at these angels, you'll notice they've all got limbs missing. And that's because over time, bits of them have fallen off. But that's because of the way they were designed. You see, there's also a language of tombstones, a symbology. Many of these monuments have a distinct meaning. And that's the way these angels were designed. They were all designed, often made in Italy. Italy was very good at mass-producing statues of angels. And so there was a great export business going on to other countries, especially Britain. But the way they were meant to look originally, you can see on the right. And you can see that this angel deliberately has one hand raised, and the other one is pointing down towards the grave. And the idea was that the angel was directing traffic, telling the soul of the dear departed which way to go. This, it said, is the way to the stairway to heaven. This is where you get to meet Led Zeppelin. That was the general idea. So this is part of the symbology of tombstones. But Abney Park didn't always look overgrown, like some sort of medieval jungle. It was actually designed as an arboretum cemetery. And when it was designed, it was meant to look pristine, as you can see in this picture here. And it was meant to show off various types of trees and plants. So it was a peaceful and a beautiful place to walk. So that's what it looked like when it was first opened in 1830. But on the other side, you can see this same place now. The same position with the fork in the roads, and as you saw, it's totally overgrown. Trees and ivy everywhere. And it's not that the Friends of Abney Trust have left it like this on purpose. They look after it very closely, and they allow nature to take over parts of the cemetery. And that adds to its appeal. But it was originally designed on the grounds of a stately home. And you can see that in the picture up above us. This was what Abney Park used to be. It was the private home of a man called Isaac Watts. And Isaac Watts was a Scottish Presbyterian. And when he died, in his will, he stipulated that his land should be used to create a cemetery, but not just any cemetery. He wanted to make it a cemetery that was accessible for people of different faiths, the nonconformists, as they were called at the time. So this beautiful land was turned into a cemetery. The house that you can see in the middle was removed, demolished, in order to make more space. And Isaac Watts, as you can possibly guess, has a memorial right in the middle of the cemetery. He's not buried there, he was buried back in his native Scotland, but his memorial stands in the middle of Abney Park. And it's a testament to the enlightened attitude that he had, that he wanted people of different religious faiths to be buried there. It was very nice of him, Sarah. He was a real philanthropic gentleman. So this was meant to be a graveyard not just for Church of England, but for the nonconformists. And as far back as the 15th and 16th century, you could be a nonconformist in different ways. This is a kind of satire of the time, a catalogue of the several sects and opinions in England and other nations, with a brief rehearsal of their false and dangerous tenets. So these are some of the examples of what you could do to be labelled as a conformist. You could be a Jesuit. You could be an Armenian and an Anabaptist, a bit like a nudist by all accounts. You could be a libertine that you could see on the right-hand side, which sounds like a 90s rock group. Down on the bottom left, you could be an anti-scripturian. In other words, you would go around destroying Bibles just for fun. Or you could be a soul sleeper, which sounds like a heavy metal band from the year 2010. You could be a familist. I've no idea what a familist is, but it sounds interesting. Or you could be a seeker, which sounds like a 1970s pop band. And finally, you could be a divorcer and a wife beater as well, by the look of it. He was a mensch. He was indeed, Lynn. He was a really nice mensch. So these were some of the many ways that you could be labelled as a nonconformist. And Isaac Watts wanted to make sure that when his cemetery was built, it would have available capacity for these people to be buried there. Right in the middle of the cemetery, where there used to be the grand stately home, there's now a chapel. And again, the chapel was designed in a nonconformist style, the idea being that any service could take place there for people of different faiths. As you can probably see, the chapel itself has fallen into disrepair. This is what it looked like a couple of years ago. They're actually working on rebuilding it, using National Lottery money to rebuild this amazing chapel. But at the moment, it's just the shell of its former self. But if you look at it from above, you can see in this aerial picture on the left that it's in the style of a cruciform cross, a Greek cross. And again, this was to symbolise the fact that it was for burials of all different denominations. Oh, sorry. Let's have a look there. You can see the inside of the chapel. Again, as it looked a few years ago, I think by now they've probably done a lot more work on it. But it was deserted and left to rot. And it's been renovated using National Lottery money. There's an even older and more interesting tree right next to it. And this, as you can see, is a Western bean tree, and it was specially imported from Australia. And the Western bean tree is impervious to all sorts of things, including fire. So this particular tree has survived bombing raids by the German Air Force during World War II. But it's managed to survive those, and it's one of the oldest trees in the cemetery. As well as nonconformists, the other people that were buried here were those that were campaigning for the abolition of slavery, the abolitionists as they were called. And there are several famous abolitionist graves in this cemetery. In fact, Isaac Watts himself had strong abolitionist views. On the left, you can see the grave of a lady called Joanna Vassar. And she was the daughter of Gustavus Vassar. And Gustavus Vassar was one of the first freed slaves to gain notoriety in England, because when he came back, he started writing books and campaigning for the abolition of slavery, as did his daughter Joanna. And you can see this is their gravestone on the left-hand side. Hello, Jerry. Good evening to you. And on the right, we've got another famous abolitionist of the 19th century. This is the Reverend Aaron Buscott. And the Reverend Buscott had been to the East Indies himself as a young man. He'd travelled widely around the world, and he'd seen the terrible conditions that the slaves were kept in. He'd seen the brutality that they suffered. So when he came back to Britain, he started preaching in any place that he could, in his own church or other people's church. Don't worry, Cherry. It's fine. We've only just begun, in the words of the Carpenters. So the Reverend Aaron Buscott and Gustavus Vassar and Joanna Vassar were all famous abolitionists. And that's something that Abney Park is strongly connected with. Near to the disused chapel in the middle of the cemetery, there's also a war memorial that you can see here. And it's managed, as most of them are, by the Imperial War Commission. So they make sure that this war memorial is kept looking neat and spruced up. And this is a memorial to the people that fought and died in the Second World War in this area. Among all these overgrown statues and monoliths, you can find some graves that are very well kept, like this one. This beautifully restored Victorian grave is the memorial to a circus owner. And on top of it, you can see Nero the lion. And Nero the lion is was the star attraction in a circus run by the man whose grave he's protecting, a man called Frank Bostock. And Frank Bostock, as you can see, was known as the Animal King in the early 19th century. And he ran what were called menageries, kind of circuses for the rich and famous all around Europe, including the kind of talking monkey that you can see here, the monkey that's so good it's almost human. So Nero is lying on top of his master's tomb. Here's a poster for the circus that he ran at the time, the Great Frank C. Bostock, Trained Wild Animal Arena and Jungle. It is a gorgeous lion, and the lion is was the star attraction of Bostock's show. Of course, these trained animals would carry on being used well into the 1970s. Here's a very famous advert for PG Tips, a very British advert for tea, which used to feature trained chimpanzees. But then, because of all the complaints about animal abuse and anthropomorphization of these animals, they stopped making these particular adverts. You work in a menagerie, do you, Fliss? Is that real, or does it just feel like that? Oh, here we've got a sideways picture. Let's see if we can turn it the right way. There. On the outskirts of Abney Park, you've got all these tiny little gravestones. Retail, there we are, yes, that's a menagerie. And when I saw these at first, I thought, are they the graves of Oompa Loompas, or, what's going on here? Why are these tiny little gravestones here? And then I did some research and found out that after they'd closed this cemetery for business, which happened in the beginning of the 20th century, basically cemeteries all around the country were going bust, partly because people were being cremated rather than buried. But during the Second World War, of course, a lot of people died in bombing campaigns, and some of them are memorialised here. So these tiny gravestones are actually memorials to people that died in the Second World War. There are some more recent graves as well, or memorials, that have been put here specially. Like this one, to a man called Eric Walrond, who wrote an amazing book called Tropic Death, which was one of the first exposés of the difficulties that people from other countries experienced when they came to Britain as refugees in the 1950s. So this was a famous author called Eric Walrond. I like the chip ants as well. And there's one thing about Abney Park that sets it apart from the others. It's cool. It's got street cred credentials, because this is where Amy Winehouse filmed her iconic video Back to Black, one of her most famous songs. And Abney Park was the cemetery where that video promotion was shot. There you can see the disused chapel in the background. So Abney Park, as well as being a beautiful place to walk, also has rock and roll credentials. But what I love about the cemetery, as you can see here, is the fact that you can go down these little overgrown paths and explore and find out places that you might never otherwise have found, buried under the undergrowth. So as I came out of Abney Park, this was my impression. Nature red in tooth and claw, mixed with faded Victorian grandeur, a breath of fresh air amidst the gravestones. So that was cemetery number 1. But of course, we've got many more to go, so we're off. with the Munsters leading the way. Herman Munster is at the wheel, driving us through the busy streets of central London, down Holloway Road, and up into leafy Highgate. And you can probably guess the cemetery that we're headed towards. Highgate is quite an exclusive area to live in, and we're coming down the hill that leads to the main entrance of the most famous of the Magnificent Seven. This, of course, is Highgate Cemetery. Highgate Cemetery was also built with the nonconformists in mind. But in this case, instead of opening up the whole cemetery to anyone who wanted to be buried there, pardon me, of any faith, instead they had two separate parts to the cemetery, the conformist part and the nonconformist. And they also had two separate chapels. And this is where the chapels are at the main entrance. On one side is the chapel for Church of England services, and the other side was reserved for the nonconformists. So this is Highgate Cemetery, opened in 1839. The cemetery itself is 150,000 square metres, and the number of burials is around 170,000. And that number is still continuing because in certain special cases, you can still be buried in Highgate Cemetery. The cemetery itself is split into two halves. One half is more popular than the other because it was built earlier, and it's the west half of the cemetery. And that's where we are now, going up the grand entrance into the older part of Highgate. And along the way you can see various sepulchres, various above-ground tombs that were very popular in Victorian times. And their occupants had really great names, like this one, Jeremiah Greatorex. What a cool Victorian name. So as well as the explosion of cemetery design, there was also an explosion in coffin design. And that's because many people wanted the kind of continental method of being buried above ground. So cemetery designers had to come up, or funeral parlours had to come up with different designs for their coffins that would allow people to be buried above ground. But you had to make sure it was done in the right way. Otherwise it could go badly wrong, and that was the case for Henry I. When Henry I died, he was put to rest in Sion Chapel in Isleworth, and he was put into a coffin and left there so that people could come and pay their respects. Unfortunately, by that time, Henry I was quite a large chap. He'd eaten quite a lot during his lifetime, and he was laid to rest in the summer, laid in state as it was called. And unfortunately, the really hot weather made things difficult inside the coffin. His body began to decompose at an alarming rate, to the extent that people came in one day and saw that it was leaking. So they very quickly decided to take the body and reinter it somewhere else, in a fresh coffin. So being buried above ground, being laid to rest above ground, was all very well, but you had to make sure it was done in the right way. Highgate Cemetery, in common with many of the Magnificent Seven, was meant to be built outside the limits of the city. And you can see that illustrated in the picture on the left. There's London in the distance. And Highgate Cemetery is actually out in the wilds, out in the very suburbs of the city. And it was again designed as an arboretum cemetery. The idea was that you would wander along its leafy paths and glades. But the main paths were reserved for the people with money, as you might expect. The ones that could afford to be buried near the main paths had to have a suitable monument erected to them. And all the lesser graves you can find scattered around the cemetery. But if you wanted something special, you had to have the money to pay for it. And you'll see all sorts of amazing funerary designs in Highgate Cemetery. On the left, for example, you've got the Roman column. In the middle, you've got Egyptian plinths and Greek urns. And on the right, you've got a sleeping angel. Now, I've seen lots of angels in lots of cemeteries, but this is one of the only angels that I've seen, pardon me, lying in a prone position, which makes it rather special. The Roman columns, by the way, many of them are designed specially to look like they're broken. Some of them have just been broken by time and the weather, but others were designed to look like that on purpose. And again, that's part of the symbology of tombstones. The idea was that a Roman column that was shorter than it should be indicated that the person buried there had died before their time, cruelly cut down in the prime of life. So that's again part of the symbology of tombstones, the idea of a short Roman column indicating a person who's been taken away too soon. You can also see more modern designs in Highgate. This one is from the 1960s, and it reflects the growing modern art movement of the time. And these traditional Roman urns. The Roman urns, of course, based on the Roman Empire and the way that the Romans like to cremate their dead at the time and then put their remains in these pots. So there's no remains in these pots. These are just meant to emulate that look. In fact, the Victorians wanted to emulate the look of the Romans and the Egyptians because they wanted to reflect the importance of their own society. These were meant to be the great societies of the time. And that's the way the Victorians saw themselves. Well, exactly, Lynn. It does. Saves time waiting for breakage. So here you can see one of these Roman columns, but this one I think has been simply affected by time and weather. Sometimes around these columns you'll see garlands of roses and also robes that you can see at the top. And these are the veils, the veil that was said to separate the world of the living and the dead. If you walk through Highgate and many other cemeteries, you'll also see markings on the side of the tomb. And these are like the signatures of the people that made them. Because Victorian cemeteries at the time was like one big catalogue. So if you were burying a loved one, you'd also have half an eye on what you wanted for your own gravestone when you shuffled off this mortal coil. So the people that designed them, the stonemasons, they would leave their signature on these tombstones so that you knew where to go if you wanted something in a similar style. The one on the left, for example, says Daniels of Highgate. Highgate as well, or certainly the west side of Highgate, has also been left to nature. And nature has been carefully allowed to take over in certain places. I especially like these tombstones that you can see here, the memorials that have been covered with ivy. The one on the right always reminds me of a face hugger from the Alien series. And right in the middle is another paean to Egyptian design that was so popular in Victorian times. And this is called Egyptian Avenue. And it looks pretty creepy. It looks like something out of an Indiana Jones movie. And it's even creepier in real life, especially if you go in the winter when it's just getting dark. Inside, once you walked into Egyptian Avenue, you'll find the Circle of Lebanon. And this is a circle of tombs. On top of these circle of tombs was a tree, and it was a Lebanon cedar, hence the name of the area. Unfortunately, the old tree that stood there had to be removed, demolished. And this was just before COVID broke out. On the left hand, you can see this picture from the 1850s, and this shows the cedar of Lebanon in its prime. Unfortunately, it was prone to various diseases, and that meant that the tree surgeons had to get rid of it. They were worried that if it died completely, that it would fall and break into the tombs below. So sadly, they had to take down the old cedar of Lebanon. But they have replaced it with a new one, which will look equally stunning in about 30 or 40 years' time. As you go down the steps into the tombs at the bottom of the Circle of Lebanon, you can imagine that it's quite an impressive place, but also quite spooky. And you might think that it looks like the setting for some Hammer horror film, a film about vampires, for instance. And you'd be right. It was. In fact, in 1970, Hammer Horror used it as the part of the set for one of their films. The film was called Taste the Blood of Dracula, which always seemed to me to be the wrong way round. Surely it was the other way round. But it was quite a popular film at the time and made a lot of money. So this was Taste the Blood of Dracula. And here you can see the heroines of the film, always in distress, of course, the beautiful virgins after whom Dracula is chasing. And they're running around the tombs in this Circle of Lebanon. Partly because this horror film in 1970 had been shot on location, it gave the idea to people that Highgate might be haunted. In fact, one person thought that there were real vampires that lived in the cemetery. And in 1970, just after the film had been released, there was all sorts of publicity about Highgate. Because one person felt that there was an evil presence here, which many people referred to as the Highgate vampire. The gentleman that you can see with the cross and the stake, looking himself like an extra for a Hammer horror film, is called David Farrant. And David Farrant was a self-styled vampire hunter, and he strongly believed that there was something evil lurking in the depths of Highgate Cemetery. And so he decided he would try and find it. Highly publicised as well. So he went on various, various vigils inside the cemetery. And what he was searching for was tombs that appeared to have been broken out of rather than into. Now, obviously, this was complete rubbish, and it was almost certainly because of the film that had been released just months before. But it started a wave of sightings of evil creatures in the cemetery, and it inspired many students who really should have known better to break into the cemetery late at night and break into coffins. David Farrant was the leader of this self-styled group of vampire hunters. But eventually he fell foul of the law, and he was charged with vandalism, breaking and entering, and theft. And he was sentenced to a prison term. After his prison term, he wrote a very successful book about his experience. So that's the story of the Highgate vampire that never actually existed. As you wander around Highgate, you can find other beautiful mausoleums, some of them small but equally impressive. Just outside the Circle of Lebanon is this one. And if you go down towards it and look through these doors leading into the mausoleum, you can see a beautiful stained glass window on the other side. there's another much larger mausoleum in the west side of Highgate. And it's the mausoleum of a man called Julius Beer, who was a newspaper magnate at the end of the 20th century. The mausoleum wasn't specifically built for him. It was built for his daughter, Ada, who died when she was only 14 years old. Julius Beer was so devastated by grief that he commissioned the building of this huge and impressive mausoleum. And this is where he was buried eventually alongside his daughter. Hello, Laurel. We're just in Highgate Cemetery, and we're looking at a lion. And this particular lion you may have seen before, because it's the same one that we saw in Abney Park Cemetery. This is Nero. And you might wonder what the same lion is doing in two different cemeteries. In this case, Nero is lying on top of another coffin. You see, the Nero that we saw in Abney Park was lying on top of his owner, Frank C. Bostock, the owner of a menagerie, a circus at the time. And that's what Nero is doing here in Highgate. But it's a different owner, a man called George Wimwell, because he was the partner of Frank C. Bostock, and he ran Bostock and Wimwell's menagerie, which travelled all over Europe, and both of them had the same affection for their star performer, Nero the Lion, that you can see in the middle of the picture. So Nero the Lion lies on two different graves in two different cemeteries. But one of the things that makes Highgate unusual is that it's got two halves. There's a west half that was the older part of the cemetery, and then there's this part, the east side. And this was built in 1856, some years after the west side had been in operation. And because it was built at a later time, it's got a different feel to it. It's also free to enter. On the west side, you have to pay to get in. But on the east side, it's free entry. And on the east side of the cemetery, you'll find that things are a little different. You've still got occasional Egyptian references, the plinths, that stand around the cemetery. You've got a fair few angels, but most of the graves in the west side, in the east side of the cemetery, are more recent. There are also some ones that are rather unusual, because this is a working cemetery and people are still buried here. You get graves from the 1970s and onwards. The one you can see on the left, by the way, is for Patrick Caulfield. He was a modern artist in the 1960s. These are some of his works. Very bold, very simple, very groundbreaking at the time. And when Patrick Caulfield died, he wanted his memorial to be the same kind of style as his own artwork. So this simply says, dead, because that's what Patrick Caulfield wanted people to know. It was a kind of reaction against all the other florid inscriptions in these Victorian graveyards. Gone before his time. Flights of angels sing him to his rest, gone to meet his maker. But Patrick Caulfield wanted a much simpler message. All he wanted people to know was that he was dead. Groundbreaking. Thanks, Lynn. I didn't even see that pun. And in the east side of the cemetery, there's arguably the most famous grave in Britain. And it's the grave to Karl Marx, the German philosopher and activist that started the whole movement of Marxism. And this is his grand memorial, and hundreds of thousands of people every year come to this cemetery to see the grave of Karl Marx. He's got an inscription on his grave too, a bit more wordy than Patrick Caulfield's. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So this is Karl Marx's suitably magnificent memorial, but it's not actually his original grave. He was buried here in the east side of Highgate, but he was buried in a much simpler tomb. This plain tombstone, laid down horizontally, not even vertical, was the original resting place of Karl Marx. But a group of Marxist supporters from Germany in the 1980s had a great idea. They wanted to replace this very simple tomb with something that they felt was more fitting for the grand man himself. And so they made an arrangement with the owners of the cemetery, and they came late at night, something like midnight one night. They came around, and because they didn't want press attention, overnight they changed the resting place of Karl Marx to a far more impressive monument that you can see on the left. There's also a much more recent and very special grave here in the east, actually in the west side of the cemetery. But I can't tell you exactly where it is, and that's because the parents of the person that's buried there were very specific. They didn't want too much publicity given to the exact location of this grave. In fact, the name that's inscribed on his grave is his original Greek name. You probably know him better as George Michael. And George Michael's resting place is here in the west side of Highgate Cemetery. So that's Highgate. Melodramatic, awe-inspiring, the epitome of Victorian Gothic and Egyptian romance. But we're on the move again. And this time we're going to head across the river, going through Peckham and Westminster, crossing the bridge and heading over into South London. And we're at the next one of the Magnificent Seven. This is built in 1840. Nunhead was opened in 1840. It's 210. Hello? Testing. 1, 2. Oh. Something's happened. Oh dear. Hello. It looks like people are rejoining again. Lost me I know. There was something strange went on with the connection. I do apologise. But it does seem to be back with us, which is good. So welcome back. You kept buffering. That's not a good feeling. Sorry about that, everyone. I hope that we're back online now, that everything is back to normal. I hope it doesn't happen again. We'll see how it goes. So this is Nunhead Cemetery. Hello, Terry, you found me again. That's good. This was opened in 1840, 210,000 square metres. Number of burials has been around 250,000. What did we do before the internet? Watched bad television, I think is the answer. Nunhead also used to look extremely different when it was first designed in 1840. It was much grander than it is now. It's now a mere shadow of its former self. Hello, Lorraine. Big cutout, but came back. Not sure where I am. I'm here, Lorraine. I'm hoping that you are too. So you can see the grand entrance to Nunhead Cemetery here. And while it wasn't quite as prestigious as Highgate, and it was further away from London, one of the furthest out of the Magnificent Seven. Hello, Mia. Good evening to you. It was still pretty impressive. And you can see how impressive it was when you walk into the main entrance, there's this beautiful tree-lined route leading to a magnificent chapel at the far end. And as you come in, you might think that it is really well looked after and well kept. But appearances can be deceptive, because this is much like Abney Park. It's actually been left as a nature trail. This is another of the cemeteries where nature has been allowed to take over. And you can see that as you get further into the cemetery itself. Sarah, you believe your nan is buried there? Wow. What a cool place to be buried. So you can see, again, that nature has been left to encroach on the tombstones and the memorials, ivy and trees everywhere. And again, it's a lovely place to go and walk your dog, go jogging, as many people do. And again, the tombstones themselves are often hidden under layers of ivy and thyme. But among all these old and neglected tombstones, there are still some that are quite famous. You can also find another example of the symbology of tombstones here. This lovely rock with an anchor attached to it, you might think represents someone that was in the Navy, an admiral or something like that. But actually this is another part of the symbology of tombstones, because the rock with an anchor attached to it was meant to represent a person's faith in Christianity. The idea was that the anchor of their faith was strongly connected to the rock of Christianity. So this is yet another of the symbology of tombstones. But among these deserted and ancient tombstones, there are still some that are quite famous. As you wander through the beautiful leafy paths, you can find some that are quite well kept, like this one. This is John Buckley, VC, meaning Victoria Cross. And he was one of the people that was involved in the Indian Mutiny, as it was called at the time, what we now think as the Indian fight for independence. John Buckley was in Cawnpore at the time when the Indian Mutiny took place, and his family were killed by the rioting natives. And John Buckley decided to launch a plan of revenge against these mutineers. And he was one of the people that led bands of soldiers trying to root out the mutineers and dispose of them in various interesting and rather horrible ways. He won a Victoria Cross for his work, but his work was also quite vindictive. He was on a personal search for revenge against the murder of his family. And he was the man that came up with the horrifying idea of tying these mutineers to live cannons and then blasting their bits out at the enemy. A very strong message to the mutineers. So that's John Buckley, Victoria Cross. There's also a large monument in the middle. There's a monument to what were called the Scottish mutineers, the Scottish martyrs as they're known. And in the late 18th century, they were found guilty of publishing seditious material. The material was the work of Thomas Paine, the great writer of works like The Rights of Man, who took part in the American War of Independence. And these Scottish publishers were found guilty of distributing his works. They weren't executed, but they weren't sent to jail, where many of them died of associated illnesses. So they're known as the Scottish martyrs. There's also a much smaller but equally well-kept war memorial to the people that fought in the Great War and the Second World War. And right in the middle, as with Abney Park, there's a disused chapel. This one, I don't think they have any plans at the moment to rebuild. It's kind of too far gone, really. And it's open on the inside, as you can see. So this beautiful neo-Gothic style chapel is still used for various events. And one of the events that takes place here is the annual meeting of the London Vampire magazine. Yeah, of course there is. There's a London Vampire magazine. It would be in London, wouldn't it? And the people that are subscribers to this rather peculiar magazine, they often have their annual general meetings, their jolly day out, in cemeteries like Nunhead. You can see a meeting of their cemetery, of their vampire society, on the right-hand side, grouped around one of the largest tombs in Nunhead. Nunhead is also the highest up of the Magnificent Seven, the one that's at the greatest elevation. And because of that, when you're walking through the cemetery, you can get occasional glimpses down into the city, like this beautiful view through the trees of St. Paul's Cathedral. So that's Nunhead, a neo-Gothic woodland walk, ghosts of greatness amid the undergrowth. Now, along the way, as ever, I'm going to post various links where you can find me on PayPal and buy me a coffee and show your appreciation and support, as I know you always do. So I'm going to post that link now. Just going to find it. There you are. Yeah. So I'm going to post that link on the website as we go. Let's do that now. There we are. So that was Nunhead. And we're carrying on. Herman Munster has got much more riding to do. Hello, Sammy. Good evening to you. We're just taking a trip with Herman Munster and family in the Munstermobile. I can't remember if that's what it was actually called. And we're in South London. And we're heading down into Norwood. And we're going to a place that I know very well because I used to live very close to it. You think I need a throat trouble? And there does seem to be a problem with my voice tonight. I do apologise. Hello, Elizabeth. Good evening to you. So we're heading into Norwood, and this is an area that I used to live. I used to live just round the corner from this particular cemetery. And it is understandably one of my favourites. This is West Norwood Cemetery. And it's quite different from the ones that we've already seen. That's because it is very much a working cemetery. There's a crematorium attached to it. This is West Norwood, built in 1837. That's what it looks like from above. And it's got 160,000 square metres, and the number of burials has been around 200,000. And it's rising, because West Norwood is a operating cemetery because of its crematorium. As you go inside the cemetery gates, it's got two halves to it. On one half, you can see these old Victorian Gothic-looking graves. And on the other side, you can see that there are much more modern graves, and it's all much more well kept. In fact, the man who built this cemetery, William Tyle, is also buried here, the man that designed it. And when it was designed, it was designed as what was called a pleasure garden cemetery. So not quite an arboretum. The idea was it wasn't meant to show off any special plants or trees. It was just meant to be designed as a pleasure park where you could wander around little groves. And it's also on a hill, which makes it quite different from the ones we've seen before. So there are two distinct parts to the cemetery, and one of them is much more modern. On the left, you can see the modern side of the cemetery with graves from the 1940s onwards. On the other side is a much older part with classic Victorian tombstones. The reason there are two halves to this cemetery is because the council in the 1990s tried to clear out many of these graves. They said they wanted to create more space for new burials. So they took away some of these ancient Victorian tombstones, and eventually the Friends of West Norwood made a legal case against them. And it was ordered that they should stop doing it. The council had been illegal in what they were trying to do, trying to remove these ancient monuments and the graves that were underneath them. So fortunately, they put a stop to that. And that's why one half of this cemetery entrance is very modern and the other one is much older. As you come into the cemetery, you can see some of these great mausoleums, like this one, with its windowed cross at the top. And again, as is the case in many of these Victorian cemeteries, the most imposing monuments are the ones that line the route. You hope they're haunted. I'm sure they are. I'm pretty sure they're haunted. You've got some much more modern examples, 1960s, 1970s, modern art kind of design. And this lovely one on the right of a young child with her hand on the grave. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think I might have to, hello, I might have to end this tour rather prematurely. I don't know if you've noticed, but I know some of you have, that my voice appears to have gone. I'm not quite sure why, but as Mia said, I think there's a frog in my throat. And I'm not convinced that my voice is going to hold out until the end of the night. But I hope you enjoyed our little tour around some of those Magnificent Seven. I will, I think, do a sequel and do the Magnificent 3.5 and include the ones that I missed out this evening. I need a warm drink. That's what I need. But yeah, I'm not sure that my voice is kind of up to the job this evening. Probably too much drunken Irish shouting at St. Patrick's Day. No, there wasn't, honestly. But thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to go now and take a warm drink with lots of honey in it. And hopefully that will help my voice to recover. Thank you all very much for coming anyway, and I look forward to seeing you again. In fact, I'll see you on Thursday, and we're going to be doing a new tour where I'm taking you around Borough Market and Shakespeare's Globe and various other exciting places. But for now, from me and my croaky voice, I wish you all a very good evening. Goodbye.